We're going to be imparting information about the timeline of the Cotter Lincoln Park Superfund site. So are you in the right room?
Yes.
We're off to a good start then.
All right. Around the room, you're going to see all kinds of posters. This is probably 1/4 of the collection of posters that we have that begin to tell the story, particularly about the time that the Maywood waste was going to be coming into our town. And citizens of all walks of life, many of them doctors, we all formed Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste to address that plan by Cotter to bring in that waste. And we went up to the governor and asked for a moratorium on the whole thing until we could investigate it. And then as the years went by, the closer we looked at what Cotter was about, the worse it got. So anyway, that's what you'll see there. But think about it, that's 20 years ago, okay? So here we are today, and we still have a Superfund site upwind, upstream, and over the fence from Canyon City. There's about 7 million tons of radioactive waste up there. So, to introduce myself, I am the vice chair of the Community Advisory Group, which meets every month with the EPA and the Department of Health. And we have been stepping through the process, which is, as Superfund. It's also known as CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act. Now that was an act that was passed by Congress in 1980. So you may hear me refer to CERCLA, and that's what that stands for. I am also a founding director of Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste, and I've been doing this kind of work for 21 years now. There is a powerful group of citizens that came together to do the research, and in the course of these 20 years, we have had over 30 different directors on the CCAT board. So other things, my father was one of the scientists that was recruited from Grand Junction, National Lead, to come to Canyon City and help, Dave Marcotte was his name, start this little uranium processing mill. And then my dad was the whistleblower when he said, we're contaminating the wells. Back in the day, the best practice was to process the ore and then put the tailings out on the bare ground and let natural attenuation take its course. But this is radioactive tailings, and there's lots of waste in this particular industry. And I have several video clips that will help us discuss this in a very streamlined way. And then after my father had blown the whistle, his house was vandalized, and the entire inside of furnishing were destroyed, and they specifically destroyed his library. So this is the background that I come from. And my father was, I can remember as a child, the sugar in our pantry was C12H22011. So although he was the scientist, it didn't really rub off on me, but the troubles did, and so that's why you see me doing what I'm doing today. My father died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was attributed to someone putting something in his coffee. So, at any rate, that was a long time ago, but you understand my motivation, and I know how dangerous that this can be, and the work that we've done in the last 20 years has revealed that, and our best defense is education about this. This site, in my mind, is it's a natural feature now, part of the environment. much the same way an ocean is part of the environment. So if you can learn how to live safely with what's in the environment, then you'll be fine. So today, we're not about pointing fingers and trying to say, oh, they did this, oh, they're so bad, oh, yada, yada, yada. We're trying to get some education about the site so that as we move forward, our elected officials and so forth can make good decisions knowing where the contamination is gone. A little grounding in that, we are in the remedial investigation part of looking at the site, and that is one step in the CERCLA process. And that step, well, those of us who serve on the CAG and have been working this, we've been in this step for over 12 years. And that's because it keeps starting over. And as you know, we've lost CLL right now because they've dropped the keys in the parking lot. And so the work that we have done these last 5 years, is stopped right now. And as soon as the regulators figure out how to proceed, then it will pick up again. So, fingers crossed. One of the next steps is a work plan, which is where we are also now. The feasibility includes a work plan, and we're at that point in time in this process of looking at the site and getting it cleaned up. After the work plan is approved, then the next step would be to move into the feasibility study and evaluate how to clean the site. So that's a very oversimplified discussion of a very complex problem. So how many of you live in Lincoln Park? Okay. How many of you, all of you, how many of you have known about Cotter? Okay. That's good, because then I kind of have an idea of where we're going here. So the first thing I'm going to do, again, I didn't mean for us to have just a lot of videos here, but I've taken some clips from some very specific videos, and I can also send the links to the entire videos because I have your emails. So those I can send after the class.
This is the tale of two towns in western Colorado that were inflamed by enthusiasm for mining and refining the rock called carnotite, with its stored resources of radium, vanadium, and uranium that held the potential for unimagined riches, scientific discovery, miracle cures, and the ultimate force to energize or destroy nations.
It's the story of the three different booms and busts that we have related to this one rock in western Colorado.
The uranium boom was much bigger than gold and silver, including California and including Pikes Peak and all of these places.
The government needed the uranium so bad they spent millions of dollars to get it, and their wildest dreams were fulfilled. They found so much.
Uranium made one town famous, while the other town was almost completely buried by its own radioactive legacy.
Grand Junction kind of went into the uranium frenzy, the love affair that the country had.
A lot of the community felt that uranium was good to us, uranium helped us, uranium employed us. A lot of other people said, no, this is really, really going to hurt us.
Night and day, you could hear the trucks go over the noisy bridge going into Irvine, and it would clank 3 or 4 times as it goes across the bridge.
And they promised the great promise of cheap nuclear power never developed.
The bulk of Irvine was shredded and buried in a hole up on top of the mountain above Irvine. It's all buried in there. It was covered up and everything's gone.
To this day, both towns remain fascinating yet fearful symbols of the rise and fallout caused by a century of uranium mania.
Eventually, by the late 1890s, carnotite makes its way into France. And some scientists in France take a close look at it and they realize that carnotite contains three very valuable things.
The uranium that was dismissed as waste rock before it was transformed into an engine of power and doomsday device. Vanadium that would strengthen the lightweight steel of the Panama Canal, Henry Ford's cars, and the weaponry of 2 world wars. And radium, a rare metal worth far more than its weight in medical and experimental value. Made famous by its first lady, Marie Curie, who dedicated her life to researching its radioactive effects, only to die of radiation poisoning.
In the 19-teens, radium was one of the most valuable things on Earth. 1 gram of radium was selling for upwards to $160,000.
And that's a tiny, tiny, tiny amount, but you'd have to mine hundreds of tons of uranium ore to get that tiny speck.
Madame Curie's daughters say that she never came to Western Colorado. When she came to get her 1 gram of radium from the Women of America in 1921, she did visit the White House. She visited the Standard Chemical plant in Canonsburg and the lab in Pittsburgh. And she did get on the train and go see the Grand Canyon. But they said that she never made it to Western Colorado, although she wanted to, because her radium did come from these mountains, these hills.
Pretty soon the Soviet Union develops the technology themselves. Pretty soon now we have 2 global superpowers with atomic energy. And this renews an interest. So in 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission is established with this idea of making sure that the United States keeps a global superior knowledge and supply and stockpile of uranium.
And so began a manic dash for the all-American sources of the ore that was accelerated by the first and only government-subsidized mineral rush.
There was a full-scale exploration for uranium reserves in the Colorado Plateau area. And they found uranium beyond their wildest dreams. They were so successful.
They offered all these deals, all these bonuses and incentives and all that. You could get $10,000 for a brand new discovery of high-grade ore, or if you found a new discovery, you could get up to $35,000 for that. This uranium boom was one of the greatest mineral hunts we ever had, funded by the government, and I don't think we'll ever see anything like it again. But it was something to see prospectors climbing the hills looking for uranium all over, not really know what they're doing.
But fervently believing in a get-rich-quick cult promoted by the Atomic Energy Commission, preached by the popular media, and radiating throughout the country.
Life magazine writes an article on Grand Junction, and they call it the city that glows. They talked about this area being this hotbed for uranium and uranium research and uranium mining. And so they claimed that at night Grand Junction has a subtle glow to it because of all the uranium nearby. Perhaps my favorite element during this time period, I think what really captures this idea best, is the 1954 Miss Atomic Energy competition held in Grand Junction. And the winner received whatever a truck full of uranium was valued at that day, and running it through inflation, that'd be about $4,000.
Of course, the bust, as it always must, was coming in a series of atomic shock waves, beginning with the end of the government's payouts because of a uranium glut.
They were looking at their budget and they said, we can't buy all that uranium. So they made the famous announcement that I'll never forget on November 24th, 1958, that beginning in 1962, they'll only buy uranium in concentrate from ores that were discovered prior to that date. So that really shut down the uranium exploration program.
Then, suddenly, death from a slow developing disease started shaking the uranium workers and their families.
Actually, my father was the first one that died of lung cancer associated with uranium miner in this area that they knew about.
Their health was being impacted by primarily radon gas that was in the mines because the mines were not ventilated. But it takes over 10 years for these cancers to show up.
The development of uranium, the use of uranium, is probably one of the crowning achievements for mankind from a scientific standpoint. This is absolutely amazing. We split an atom, we had this vast amount of energy, we figured out how to contain it, and we figured out uses for it. The contrast to that, though, is at what cost?
Which isn't just a hypothetical question of politics, physics, or economics, but one of personal victories and casualties.
A lot of people say, well, how can you want to open up this industry again with both of your husband and your father dying as a result of their mining history? And those guys knew that there was a danger, but they were feeding a family.
People's perception of nuclear energy and nuclear technology is very tied into their emotions. And I understand that because it's a high risk, it's low probability that anything will happen, but if something does happen, it's very high risk.
As risky or rewarding as the fire next time unleashed from within the Pandora's rock of the Colorado Plateau that could end in the ashes of an inferno, the dust of a tomb, or the nuclear-fueled West resurrected by some future mania for uranium.
That's hopefully gives you a little sense of the mindset of the world, of our nation at the time that uranium was beginning to be a big thing. And this is fairly recent history. Our job is to not forget. It only takes 8 years for a community to forget. And so our job is to keep the history part of it alive. So one of the things that Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste is in the midst of is applying for a grant that will embed and curriculum into our community. That'll be one part of what it does. Like I said, my family, my father brought his young family, me, I was 2, from Grand Junction, and he was working for National Lead at the time. And there was this company that wanted to start, and it was Cotter Corporation. And they recruited the scientists from National Lead to come. So as a young man, he moves all his people over here and then helps to get it started. The hope and dream was different then. They were beginning to move into hopes that things would be a good, clean energy source going forward. And I remember as a child, the culture of Cotter was very nice. I mean, it was, you'd have all kinds of activities that the employees would put together, Christmas parties, picnics, that kind of stuff. So nobody intended the consequence that we are facing now. So this next piece is going to be a history of, it's a very short clip that shows what Cotter did out there, the kind of thing that what the milling looked like that caused the mess.
Along the winding roads that have been forged through the busy mesa country, a ceaseless stream of trucks carries the precious ore to buying stations and more than a dozen processing mills. The mill at Uravan, Colorado, one of many, lies in the heart of one of the oldest and richest uranium mining sections on the plateau. After each load of ore is weighed, it is dumped into receiving bins. From there, it is carried to a series of crushers, where it must be broken to a fine size before processing begins. Such mills must process hundreds of tons daily, for each ton of ore yields but a few pounds of uranium. In huge rotating cylinders, the minerals in the finely ground ore are dissolved with acid. Once in solution, they leave the containers as a slurry. In a series of vats, the solids of the slurry settle to the bottom, leaving most of the uranium concentrate in solution. But with a metal as valuable as uranium, even the settling sands must be combed for any remaining metal. In rotating filters, liquids are drawn off from the sands. And then, under fire, the sands are dried for reprocessing. The final result is a uranium compound in solution, which is piped into storage tanks, and then through long filter presses, where the liquid is squeezed out of the uranium precipitate, leaving behind a clean, bright, clay-like material called yellow cake. And thus the labors of the plateau come to an end.
This particular site is a place you can go for some of these old videos. I toured Cotter when I was a child. My father took me through where he worked. And yes, it was very much like that. The one thing they didn't show was that the tailings, which is the dry waste, and the raffinates, which is the liquid waste, were put out on the ground because that was the best practice at the time. They didn't realize that it needed to be done any different. So, and we all do that. We all cook with the recipe we've got, but as we get smarter, then we do other things. So this next one is a PowerPoint. Well, it's self-explanatory, but in the interests of time, I'm letting it run instead of me getting lost in all of the storytelling.
This program presents an overview of Operating Unit 1 at the historic Cotter Mill site. It is one part of an orientation package for new members serving on the Cotter Mill Lincoln Park Superfund Site CAG, or Community Advisory Group. Hi, my name is Jerry Fry. It is May 2021. I am CAG Vice Chair and member, and I'm also co-founder of Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste. Join me for a look at one piece of this huge story. Cotter is 3 miles south of Main Street, Canyon City, and east of Dawson Ranch on County Road 143. The company incorporated in Roswell, New Mexico in 1956. 1 year later, the Atomic Energy Commission granted Cotter a license to mill uranium in Fremont County. In 1968, Colorado became an agreement state and assumed responsibility for regulating Cotter. That same year, Cotter began to receive waste from the production of the first atomic bomb, that is known as the Manhattan Project. By 1984, it was a toxic mess and declared a Superfund site by the EPA for silently contaminating the groundwater of neighboring Lincoln Park. Here is an aerial map for you to get your bearings. You can see Canyon City, Lincoln Park, and Brookside. The golf course greens are visible down by the red boundary, and the red boundary is Cotter's restricted area, as depicted at that time. It is not the entire property that they own, it is only the restricted area. As an agreement state, Colorado created the Radiation Management Unit under the state's Department of Health. Notice this is an older and shorter name for now what is called the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. This entity was given regulatory authority over Cotter and often went to the radioactive industry in the early years for answers to regulatory questions. After the urgent secrecy of the Cold War, the idea was to harness the new nuclear energy for power. This location was chosen to build a processing mill. To oversimplify a very complex process, let's say the state-of-the-art was truck in the ore, crush it, and dissolve it in chemicals, precipitate it out into yellow cake, put it through a multi-part drying process, which takes away the raffinates, liquid chemicals, and the tailings, or residue, which were cast out on the ground, leaving Cotter with 2% yellow cake as well as vanadium and molybdenum as desirable byproducts. But the lion's share of what went through the mill came out as heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and radioactive waste. From 1900 to 1950, the business was coal mining. The 32-square-mile mining district left a honeycomb of inactive mine workings, today mostly full of water. Enter Cotter, one section of land leased from the state of Colorado. A section is 1 square mile or 640 acres. By 1962, Canyon City was building and growing. A new hospital, new high school, a new county courthouse, new building at St. Scholastica Academy and at Holy Cross Abbey, and new uranium processing mill. Life was good. The local economy was pretty good too, but very few people really knew Cotter was one of only 3 mills in the nation processing uranium for nuclear fuel. There are 3 dark areas on this slide. These are the tailings pooling on the ground at the new mill site. The straight dark lines are the greens of the golf course. Keep in mind this is upstream from Lincoln Park. The gap for Sand Creek is marked with a red line. Then an enormously heavy rainstorm hit in 1965, washing the tailings down Pine Street into Lincoln Park. It washed through the gap at Sand Creek, down Pine Street, stripping away soil all the way down to the water and sewer lines on its way to Sherman Avenue. Cotter sits about 400 feet upstream from Canyon City. This was the first, but not the only flood incident of the tailings. Contamination went off-site in many ways. Almost immediately after the mill opened, contamination began leaving by air as fugitive dust, similar to what these pictures show, by surface water in the tailings floods that we just saw, by groundwater showing up in the well water after livestock became ill in Lincoln Park, even on workers' clothing that went home to be laundered. Cotter built the impoundments in 1978. 2 distinct areas were defined, the primary and the secondary. The Department of Health wanted the impoundments to contain the uranium tailings for 25 to 30 years. Water Saver Company was the lowest bidder and featured this huge 157-acre impoundment project on their website. Several jobs were filled by local people, many of whom witnessed and reported large heavy equipment damage to the Hypalon liner during installation. This is the Waller as-built construction report of the impoundments. The red dots indicate the 17 natural springs as reported then. The primary impoundment is the area to the right. The secondary impoundment is the area to the left and is 40 feet higher in altitude than the primary. To the best of our research, the 110,000 tons of Manhattan waste were moved into the secondary impoundment. There is lots of natural water movement at this location, and the underdrains were to keep the springs from intersecting with the tailings, which could potentially wash downstream. There is still a remarkable amount of water and water movement across the site. In an attempt to contain the contamination, the SCS dam, or Soil Conservation Service dams, were built in 1972. The one to the east stopped the flow of Sand Creek, which also stopped the recharge of wells in Lincoln Park, and the orchards began to die out. Then, in 2000, a PRTW, or Permeable Reactive Treatment Wall, was installed in an attempt to treat any groundwater getting past the dam. This slide shows tailings accumulating in the new secondary impoundment at the back or top of the slide. Other sites had success with the PRTW when they installed an array of them. Cotter installed one. By the time this picture was taken in 2002, the permeable reactive treatment wall was no longer functioning. It was overwhelmed with contaminants and was renamed the cutoff wall. By 2002, EPA issued a record of decision that stated all work necessary to remediate contaminated soil in Lincoln Park had been accomplished. This consisted of digging and excavating and hauling the dirt up to the Cotter site. Cotter opened business on what is historically called a school section, that is 1 square mile or 640 acres. Over time it proved cheaper to buy up land than to clean it up, and Cotter owned over 2,500 acres by the year 2007. The yellow line shows Cotter's property boundary. This map is from CLL's Conceptual Site Model, Part 2A, page 21. It highlights the primary and secondary impoundments, as well as the old tailings pond area. The maroon-colored line is Cotter's property boundary. The teal-colored line shows Operating Unit 1. The salmon-colored line shows the restricted area. The mill was sited here because of the geology. As you can see, there is a basin-like feature to the ground. The mill and original tailings were situated atop the Wolf Park coal mine. That mine had been shut down in early 1900 due to water flooding. In 1958, Cotter thought they might use the water in their mill processes. The water proved too mineral-laden, and after the shaft was used for a time as waste disposal, it was sealed in 1979. Yet seepage from the tailings was found in the mine 4 years later in 1983. Coal mines. What you see here is a close-up of a map of underground mines. The red line on this small section will appear on the next slide to orient you. There are 32 square miles of inactive coal mine workings on the south side of the Arkansas River in Canyon City. So here is your red line off to the right. Fremont County has 10,131 recorded mine claims and 225 active mines according to the United States Geologic Survey. This purple line indicates the Wolf Park mine shaft running through the hogback south of Cotter. and exiting on the south side of the hogback. This is the feature as seen on County Road 143, also known as Oak Creek Grade Road, on the south side of Slonovich Ridge. The liner, installed in 1979, had a 30-year life, which expired in 2009. Cotter processed uranium ore to extract and concentrate it and end up with yellowcake, the first step in making fuel for nuclear reactors. This is a dirty radioactive process. The makeup of uranium out of various mines across the state and the world differs wildly, and Cotter tried both alkali and acid leach and some experimental ways to break out the yellowcake. The process yielded 98% waste to the impoundments and 2% finished yellowcake. All kinds of waste has been dumped into these impoundments. Tailings, soil cleanup from our Santa Fe depot and other off-site locations, chemicals, radioactive equipment and byproducts, calcium fluoride, thorium, as well as the Manhattan Waste Project from St. Louis, Missouri, that came across the nation by open rail cars, leaving a radioactive trail. The entire impoundment is 157 acres and 125 feet deep at its deepest. By the end of 2011, the report is 5.3 million tons of radioactive waste. These next 3 slides show the kinds of waste Cotter has taken in. Like any business, Cotter needed to make money, and the yellowcake market wasn't doing it. That is a whole different story. Money could be made, however, by taking in homeless waste. This slide shows what Cotter took in from Colorado. The Shattuck site did not come to Canyon City because of citizen objections. More waste from across the U.S. that Cotter took for disposal. CCAT and our community stopped New York's Lee Tungsten waste and New Jersey's Maywood waste. It took this community 6 years to stop the Maywood Superfund site waste from coming to Cotter for long-term disposal. Waste from the world's waste stream that Cotter took in for disposal. These are the things that are in the primary and secondary impoundments. It is not easy to visualize the landscape at Cotter, because it is situated in such a way as to be invisible from the adjacent areas. The huge tailing ponds truly are out of sight and out of mind. They can be seen from the air, or from satellite, or from a spot called Slonovich Ridge on the hogback south of the mill. That ridge is owned by the Chandler Creek Companies. The next slides are a time-lapse study of the secondary impoundment from 2002 to 2021. November 2002. Cotter was still a licensed mill. Most of the color changes are due to pH levels. July 2003. Remember, the secondary impoundment is the smaller area of the two and is 40 feet higher in elevation than the primary. October 2004. Mill production effluents and tailings are liquid, but they are not just water. July 2007. Secondary impoundment. June 2008 is 13 years ago. July 2009, we began to see the secondary impoundment drying. We knew of no change to the court order that this secondary impoundment was always to be covered with 1 foot of water to control radon emissions. By November 2009, it was clear this drying was a planned activity. January 2010, dewatering, drying, evaporating. End of January 2010, Cotter described the tailings as being like jello and very difficult to cover. 1st of February 2010, Cotter set about closing the secondary impoundment. March 2010, without community knowledge or input. April 2010. This is going on before the Superfund CERCLA process. May 2010. Going. June 2010. Going. As stakeholders, the public must always insist on public involvement. November 2010. Gone. So, out of sight, but not really gone. Next, attention turns to demolition of the mill buildings. Summer of 2007. Cotter was clearly still operating. You can see the zirconium pile off to the left, and behind it are the CCD tanks. Cotter was licensed and continued operating in the middle of their own Superfund mess for 27 years. But Cotter called it quits in December of 2011. This triggered the EPA involvement through the federal CERCLA, which is the acronym for an act of Congress called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or commonly known as Superfund. But in less than a month, January already saw them tearing down buildings and burying them in the impoundment. Yes, pushing everything into the primary impoundment. All of the on-site demolition and unprocessed ores, except for the zirconium, was pushed into the primary impoundment for burial. The liner was designed for tailings. Here we see rubble. Even before they called it quits in December of 2011, we see in September the primary impoundment. Here are 4 tankers from a shipment from Sequoia Fuels. These were too radioactive to scrap in the conventional way. It appears they were buried whole, a radioactive landfill, near people and residents. Most all of the mill buildings are now out of sight in the impoundment. All of the radioactive waste is still there, estimated 5.3 million tons, including 110,000 tons of Manhattan waste, upstream, upwind, and over the fence from Canyon City. August 2018, ownership of Cotter's Canyon City property was taken over by Colorado Legacy Land, LLC, who now owns the license and cleanup responsibilities of the site. Colorado Legacy Land is committed to the CERCLA Superfund process, which requires that they know what materials are on site. Now you know some of it too. Fremont County deserves the best cleanup of our atomic home front. This is what the site looked like May 5th, 2021. All the waste we have talked about is still there, just out of sight. Contaminated groundwater continues even today to reach into the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Canyon City continues to grow up around this property. Colorado Legacy Land is now the responsible party. They are motivated to get the site closed. We are in the draft remedial investigation stage of CERCLA. Local government and local citizen involvement is critical to ensure the best cleanup is part of that closure. When the cleanup is finished, the agencies and responsible party will leave. The community will still be here. Involvement now, while these decisions are being worked out, is the best protection we can give our community. Join the CAG. The Community Advisor Group is in the room where this happens. To become a CAG member, contact one of these people. Join us in writing the future for our community. Thank you for watching.
Pretty disturbing, huh? Please take one of these and pass it on through the group. Contact information is on the back of that. On the front of that, you see the logos of the entities that have owned Cotter. Presently, the site is still owned by Cotter, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of General Atomics. And that's the federal contractor who built the stealth bomber. So, and many of you probably are aware that Colorado Legacy Land has, in essence, dropped the keys in the parking lot. And so they are gone. That leaves an enforcement action needing to happen at the state and federal level to figure out what's going to happen with the site. Let's see. One other thing I'll pass out. It is important to have community involvement. And so I've made a list of all your elected officials and your party contacts so that you can find your way there if you have something to say about this.
Mill, where we are, the conversion facility and the enrichment facility. There is contamination, water, air, and soil at every phase.
It takes thousands and thousands of gallons of water simply to explore for uranium.
It's also going to contaminate the water that is here that does get into the system.
And a water table can be contaminated by one test hole.
But when you get to the point where you're actually excavating it, where you get to the point where you're milling it, that takes millions of gallons of water.
There are 104 reactors in the country. 24 of them are in trouble because of drought.
When they come in and do an open pit strip mine, it's going to take the water out of the system.
Paducah's enrichment facility in Kentucky uses 26 million gallons of water a day.
It is a filthy industry, both coming out of the ground and going back into the ground.
99.9% of what they put out their door is uranium milling waste, and a very small amount of the volume of materials that come through is actually produced out the other end as yellow cake.
I think we've got to do a better job in figuring out how we're going to deal with the waste.
Uranium's half-life is going to be about 1,000 generations. There's no way that we can protect that far into the future.
You try to do the net present value on 1,000 years worth of waste maintenance, which is the minimum required by law, but should be at least 10,000.
Not only was there surface contamination because the ponds of old were flooded and washed into Lincoln Park, but there's groundwater contamination that is still a very persistent problem and probably will never go away. We just can't have this close to people.
If you look at nuclear energy from a lemonade standpoint of view, meaning how much do you have to spend, how much are you going to get back, and what are your potential liabilities, it makes zero sense.
Our national government knows that working in this industry is not good. It's not healthy. It's very dangerous. And the reason that I say that is because they have what's called the national apology, and that has been paying $150,000 to workers in the industry or their survivors who can prove that they have had exposure to uranium. It amazes me that our government would do that sort of thing, and on the other hand would then say how clean this industry is. Obviously, one side of our federal government is not talking with the other side.
Community is the one that suffers. The industry is careful to come in and to form things like limited liability companies, those that don't really have any assets.
Certainly there are companies that can fold their tents very quickly.
These foreign companies will come in, take our mineral wealth, leave the state with the cleanup costs.
The laws in this state are weighted toward those companies.
They get forgiven over and over again with no consequences.
The industry doesn't have to pay for its mess.